Hi, Kim. Hi, Kim, and thanks so much for the getting us set up this morning. I want to welcome everyone. It's a very brisk 19 degrees here in Wisconsin, where I am. Wind chill of about half of that. Hope it's a little warmer wherever you are. But of course, we all do know what day it is today. So happy Leap Day to everyone. Do we have anybody who's actually celebrating a birthday today? If you do, just call it out because we definitely want to wish you all a very happy birthday. So, um, because you only get to celebrate these at once every 4 years, you poor folks. So, but thanks everyone for joining us. As Kim mentioned, my name's Kirk Kiefer. I'm working with on a part-time basis with CCSSO in my retirement phase after serving a little over 10 years as an assistant state superintendent with the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, where I served as the CIO when I was in that role. So among the different things that I'm helping CCSSO with is this topic, digital equity. And CCSSO has been engaged with this for a very long time, well before, during, and after the pandemic. And today it definitely ranks as one of the highest priorities for our organization. Before the pandemic, it involved things like getting the fiber connections to schools and leveraging tools like E-rate to do that. And during the pandemic, obviously, it was a pivot to actually identifying where those physical gaps in the internet connections existed among households that had students in them. And now it really does continue to be elevating the role of what digital tools and resources can play in actually modernizing and transforming the entire learning process. So with this series, we've partnered with the U.S. Department of Ed to ensure that schools and libraries and other organizations are aware of some funds that are going to be made available later this year through NTIA. And the goal of this particular series is first to build awareness about the program, but also then to help nurture the development of some high quality project proposals that you can submit once that grant round is formally open later this year. Today's the first webinar we're going to have on this topic. On April 17th, there'll be another session that'll be hosted by our colleagues at the American Library Association and Common Sense Media. And then later this spring in May, at our meeting in Seattle, we plan to have another session that's focused on actually helping to build some of these project ideas out in the form of a proposal. As those details become more available, we'll be sending those out through the community as well. So this morning, our facilitator and moderator is our colleague Jisoo Song from the Office of Ed Tech within the Department of Ed. Many of you probably already know Jisoo. I know that for me personally and to CCSSO, he's been an absolutely invaluable partner to us as we have addressed the digital equity topic. Jisoo is going to start by giving us some kind of the broad brushstrokes on digital equity, but he's also going to put it in the context of the recently released National Ed Tech Plan, which some of you probably are familiar with already. And also he'll review some of the details of the grant program, the NTIA program, as we currently know them. Jisoo is actually going to serve then as the moderator and facilitator for the panelists, who'll be giving some of their ideas and examples about digital equity and their own experiences. These folks are absolutely outstanding resources. Hearing and talking to them about some of the things that they've been up to just absolutely blew me away, and I'm confident that you'll agree once you hear them as well. As we've said, there's time to ask questions along the way. Don't hesitate to do that. If there's a particular individual you're focusing your question on as you do that, jot that in parenthetically in your question so we know who to target as well. But we will be monitoring that as we go. So now I'm going to turn this over to you, Jisoo. Welcome and thanks very, very much.
Thanks, Kurt. And thank you to the Council of Chief State School Officers for providing this webinar opportunity to talk about some of the opportunities that are on the horizon for this K-12 community. And as Kurt already mentioned, happy Leap Day for those who celebrate. My name is Jisoo Song, serving as the Digital Equity Advisor for the Office of EdTech at the U.S. Department of Education, where my role is to engage in collaborations across the federal government, as well as experts in the field, like our panelists today, to help maximize the impact of various policies and programs that all aim to advance digital equity for our learners. Before we go into our panel discussion with experts from around the country, I want to briefly provide some context and an overview of the why behind today's webinar. So if you have any questions, as Kurt already mentioned, please feel free to use the Q&A function as you listen in. And if you could just note, which speaker you're directing your question to, that would help us a lot as well. So I'm going to start out with the National EdTech Plan, actually. Many of you might already know that the Office of EdTech published our 2024 NETP last month. As the flagship EdTech policy document for the US, the NETP sets a vision for what systemic solutions are necessary to ensure technology is used effectively for teaching and learning. Among other topics, the NETP spotlights what we call the digital access divide, right? The need to ensure that all students and families are equipped with the high-speed connectivity, devices, digital content, accessible tools, and digital health, safety, citizenship skills that they need to succeed, right? So today's discussion on digital equity fits right underneath that bucket that's mentioned in the NETP. Let's develop a common understanding of some key concepts. You might already be familiar with these concepts, but it's always to have a good refresher on some things that we sort of take for granted. But according to the bipartisan infrastructure law, digital equity is achieved when individuals and communities have the informational technology capacity that's needed for full participation in society of the US, right? It's ultimately where we're trying to get to. It's our end goal. And then there's the topic of digital inclusion. I love the way that the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, NTIA, frames this term. If digital equity is the end goal, what we're trying to get to, then digital inclusion is the how or the components that are all necessary to meet that goal, from fixed and wireless broadband to internet-enabled devices, applications and online content, digital literacy, technical support, and as well as online privacy and cybersecurity practices. Why is this so important? Right? Why are we still talking about this after the pandemic? We know from the data, we know from the stories that it sets the right conditions that are necessary for at least three really important things. First, being from the K-12 community, we all know that educational equity is important. We know that higher home broadband adoption rates are strongly associated with higher student performance, especially for our Black, Latino, and low-income students. Community health, during the pandemic, just a % increase in broadband access in a given community reduced COVID mortality rates by approximately 19 deaths per 100,000 due to the lack of information that some communities had. Economic mobility, this is also what we all care about, right? According to the National Skills Coalition, people who qualify for jobs that require just at least one digital skill can earn an average of 23% more than those who work in jobs that require 0 digital skills. And then on top of that, the topic of the day right now is AI, and we can't neglect that, right? AI obviously has a lot of promises for education, right? From personalizing learning to reducing educator workloads. But digital equity and digital inclusion has to be foundational to all of this capability, right? We can consider this issue from 3 different angles. Obviously, home internet access. At the end of the day, a lot of our AI tools, especially the generative AI tools that are dominating the current discourse, they're web-based, right? So without equitable access to reliable high-speed internet from home, we're setting up only some learners to become creators and innovators with this technology. And then there's the cost. Obviously, there's the affordability of an internet subscription, but there's another cost issue that I want to bring up. We're already beginning to see some developers offer some really powerful premium versions of their tools for a fee. So we're kind of creating an additional barrier for learners who may not be able to reasonably afford those options. And then digital literacy, we now have to expand our thinking around digital literacy to encompass AI literacy, developing an understanding of how these tools work and how folks can best leverage them to meet their goals in a safe, healthy, and responsible manner. So coming back to the topic of digital equity, we've highlighted several examples in the OET Story platform of what strategies can help advance digital equity for our learners furthest from opportunities. I just want to briefly shout out 3 of them here who are doing some really amazing work out there. There's an organization out in Hawaii called Mapunawai who had a chance to talk with us. And through partnerships with local universities and libraries, they provide devices and basic skills development opportunities, including online entrepreneurship programs to Native Hawaiian communities, especially elderly Native Hawaiian individuals. We have folks out of Madison Area Technical College where program leaders of their high school equivalency program knew that their institution served a lot of migratory workers and their families. So they began offering devices free of charge, embedding digital skill building opportunities into their curricula. And then on top of that, they provided additional wraparound supports from flexible scheduling options to childcare. And then the library sector, Queens Library in New York, the library often serves, formerly incarcerated patrons. So they began providing devices that are paired with the mobile data service. They also began to pair participants up with a dedicated navigator who could help them use the technology to access various social services and ultimately help them reintegrate back into society, right? The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law of 2021 provided a really significant policy lever to move the needle on digital equity with this total of $65 billion in broadband investments, right? Including the Digital Equity Act programs that funded the development of state digital equity plans and are administered by our awesome colleagues over at NTIA within the Department of Commerce. The Digital Equity Act draws particular attention to what's called the covered populations, or those who we know from the data lack digital access the most, right? I won't read every one of them, but you can see them on the slide. Something you might notice is that students and learners aren't explicitly included in the list of covered populations, but we know as educators and education leaders that they overlap with every single population on this list, right? So it's super essential that the education sector gets involved with some of the national efforts happening right now, which begs the question, what are those specific national efforts that education leaders get involved with, right? States are sort of finalizing their state digital equity plans, but our colleagues at NTIA will release the next round of opportunities later this year, including some grants to help states implement their digital equity plans, what's known as the capacity grants. And then the interesting third part of the Digital Equity Act are these competitive grants, right? That's going to be available to a wide range of sectors to work on digital equity projects of their own. And obviously, NTIA is developing the final rules around this competition. But from the legislative language, we already know some key things that are going to be essential as we develop some ideas, right? Eligible entities include many folks from the education sector, including state agencies. I saw many of you in the chat already, nonprofits, anchor institutions, local education agencies, so our school districts, workforce development programs, and partnerships with any of these eligible entities are eligible, right? And then the eligible uses of those competitive grant funds are really diverse, and they're already in line with what many leaders in the education sector have been doing already, even before the pandemic, from digital inclusion activities to promote broadband adoption, training and workforce development, making devices more available to communities, and expanding public access to the internet as well. These are things that the education sector has been doing and can continue to do in light of these new opportunities. Again, our colleagues at NTIA that are working day in and day out to develop this program won't announce the final rules around the opportunity until probably later this year. But I want to share some resources that may help support your initial idea generation efforts. First, you may have seen this publication before a lot, since I've talked about it a lot at other OET events. We have this Advancing Digital Equity for All guidance resources that identifies some critical barriers to broadband access for our learners, focusing primarily on some human-level adoption barriers that lie outside of physical infrastructure, and suggest some promising strategies for navigating those barriers. You can visit tech.ed.gov/DEER to download that. We also have our digital equity story engine. Whenever you're developing ideas, we know that additional examples always help. So we've been collecting stories of innovators from across the country on tech.ed.gov/stories. I spoke about a few stories that are already on the engine at the top of this presentation, including Mapunawai, Madison Area Technical College, and Queens Library. And of course, we have the National EdTech Plan. The NATP features examples from all 50 states, the juvenile justice system, 2 US territories, and the District of Columbia. So those examples that are embedded throughout the National Ed Tech Plan may additionally help in learning from innovators across the field. Before passing the mic to some of our panelists, I want to close out this introductory overview with a few questions that you all can think about within the context of these upcoming grant opportunities that are coming under the Digital Equity Act. What ideas are you thinking about exploring? How can you build on the work that's already ongoing in your communities? And what resources, what relationships with partners might help in refining those ideas? So with that out of the way, I'll pass the mic to our panelists to provide us with some highlights of what they're doing to advance digital equity for students and families. And I'll start with you, Bree, from the Washington State Educational Agency.
Well, for those on the West Coast, good morning. And for those East Coast, Midwest, good afternoon. I'm Bree Strait, and I'm the Educational Technology Director here in Washington State. I'm joined by Casey Merchant, who is the Digital Equity and Inclusion Program Supervisor on my team. And I've asked him to also join us because he has played a critical role in the work that we've been doing here in Washington State. This is a little bit of a kind of a historical basis for our work in Washington State. Legislation passed in 2021 that provided funding that focused specifically on digital equity and inclusion. And primarily, we were all looking to provide one-to-one devices to school districts and students to support the distance learning, remote learning environment. At that same time, federal funding was flowing nationally and into the state. And we were really looking at how to leverage and elevate the DEI funding that we were getting at the state level so that we were not competing or duplicating the use of these funds out to our K-12 stakeholders. So the funds really granted looked at the high needs of schools and really looked at the limited access to support full or part-time technology staff. One of the things we noticed, especially in our small rural and remote districts, is the fact that they didn't have the staffing to support the technology that was being sent home and then needing the support. So part of the thing that we looked at with our grants was that staffing piece. We also looked to our partners, our educational service districts, who there are 9 in Washington State, who work within each of their regions to support the districts in their region. And as I mentioned before, we really leveraged the federal funds to maximize not only the federal goals, but also the state funds and the state goal. Casey, anything to add to that?
Sorry. No, I'll let you go on. I'll add my stuff in a little bit here.
All right, next slide, please. All right, so as we started, I hired my team at the same time I got the funding for the DEI work. And so literally everyone was hired remotely, didn't actually meet my team in person for months and months, but we established a vision for Washington State Ed Tech and DEI work. And it is all foundationally focused on equity of access. So when we started looking at the grants and developing the grants, we started looking at what are the challenges or barriers that exist just in the grant process itself, and really backing away from all of the things that get added as extra and nice to haves, and really looked at the bare bones. What are we trying to accomplish? How do we support districts in getting these funds? And how do we make sure that we're meeting, the vision of the fund and the grant? So we made it a non-competitive grant process, which was interesting because a lot of districts hadn't ever experienced a non-competitive grant process. Through Casey's ongoing support and just diligence in working with many districts, we had 55% plus rural applicants. And this was historically, we had not seen this many small rural and remote districts apply for Ed Tech grants. So this is a real win for Ed Tech, but especially Casey and his efforts. And then I just want to say the quote and talk about the 9 Mile Falls School District and hand it off to Casey. But really, 9 Mile Falls is an example of one of our small rural and remote school districts just under 1,500 students, just under 100 classroom teachers. And the impact, while it may have not been a high dollar, it had a huge impact on the small district and the educators and the students in that district. And this is just one example of many. So I'm going to hand it off to you, Casey.
All right, good morning. So I would like to add that a lot of this work came with as my experience as a small school tech director and my background, having 2 students that are special ed, having experience as a classroom teacher in rural, upstate New York. So taking my personal experiences and knowing that you've got to meet schools on their terms, right? You got to understand who are applying for these grants, and where they're coming from, and offering the resources to provide opportunities on their terms and work with them by providing the resources they need. One of the things that schools had trouble with, like, well, how do we spend money? Like, how do we get reimbursed? Like, where do we order stuff? So putting together a lot of guides for them on purchasing, on how to access the grants, giving them the grants questions even outside of the application so they can work on it as a team. And I really wanted districts to take those questions and not just have one person working in the grant portal, but be able to take those questions and work on them outside of the portal as a team to work with the folks that have the most impact and the most eyes on the ground of what the needs of the school are, and understanding that often the left hands at schools don't know what the right hands are doing, and sometimes grants would get applied and then they would stall. And then that was because the person did the grant and they submitted it, and then no one else on the other side knew that the grant was. So one of the big things is really looping around and communicating with the districts, and seeing going in and not being non-competitive allows a little bit of more interference and saying, hey, we're going to help you get this grant across the finish line. And I realized in the first round, by not being competitive, districts were not fighting for the scraps, right? They were not fighting each other, and getting districts to work with each other and putting them in contact with each other. Like, oh, you're doing this? Well, did you know this district also next to you is doing this grant? Perhaps maybe you could collaborate. And then also for districts that don't have the people in place, we provided a grant consultant to help them through the process. And then there's also the regional folks or statewide folks that are in the space to provide the resources that they need. So I worked really close with our state level special education technology center to fund them to be able to offer loaners and devices, licensing, for many of these schools that can't afford or don't have the resources, or may have one student who needs a very expensive device. They can reach out to SETC to get this. So there was a lot of cross-partner collaboration around getting districts to not feel like they were alone, and really being a lighthouse around collaboration. And in the couple years that I've been in this position, districts now come to me because they feel like they have someone out there that can point them in the right direction whenever there's a question around digital equity.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So one of the things I also wanted to talk about was maximizing cross-agency efforts to expand equity of access, and really working closely with the state broadband office and also the Department of Commerce. Our state broadband office is housed in the Department of Commerce. And we are really looking at how do we leverage the funding coming in through federal dollars, but also state dollars. And one of the things that we were able to do was create a partnership between a school district in Eastern Washington, and it's Pullman, and Pullman has a college there, and Washington State University. And when we look at that area, we think, well, that should have really great coverage. What you're looking at now is out in the remote areas where we have lots of hills and mountains. where coverage doesn't exist. And so able to facilitate a collaboration between the Department of Commerce and OSPI and Pullman Public Schools to fund a pilot project, a CBRS project, to help support not only the rural students that go to Pullman School District, but adjacent rural school districts and getting them connected as well. I'm hoping you're seeing a theme that our goal is to coordinate, collaborate, and partner to leverage and elevate everyone's work so that we can maximize and leverage the funding across all areas. The other thing that we were able to take advantage of is there was some additional funding. There was $3 million. And if you're familiar with the state funding, at least in our state, you know, we have to expend funds within the fiscal year. So it's July 1 through June 30th. And the Broadband Department of Commerce found that they had some funding that they hadn't expended. You know, you give grants, not all the money is spent. We were able to take advantage, and I say we, Royal, we, KC, really made this happen. Take $3 million from this cross-agency partnership and fund primarily focused on small, rural, and remote school districts. Just also as an aside, the program in Pullman is also looking for additional funding. We're talking about the NTIA funding, looking at how do we take a pilot project that's showing that it's successful and continue to help it grow. Anything to add, Casey, to the $3 million from the broadband office?
No, other than it was sort of a boon for many of these districts that felt like they had missed the original DEI funding. A lot of the districts came in, you know, day or two after the funding had run out, and I said, hey, just stay on the radar, and really staying on top of the district, saying, hey, put together your wish list, put together your grant anyway. And that way, once if anything comes through, and that way, you know, it was really a good stream because we had all the infra stuff in place. It made it really easy to distribute this last minute funding, and very little money went to waste because of the things we had in place for it.
And tell me again, Casey, how much time did you have?
The money started moving around April, right? And I think the grant went live May 1st. So districts, I put together sort of a disclaimer saying, you know, nothing freight, everything has to be on campus by June 30th. And I had schools telling me they had stuff, you know, come, you know, a day or two right before it expired. They had their, you know, and stuff has to be installed and, you know, moderate. I had districts that were like, we had our students and our custodians and our teachers all putting it together. So there was a lot of excitement and a lot of like, we've really built as an ed tech department a lot of faith back in the ed tech department around, you know, where our accountability and being able to, sounds cliche, but like really fill in gaps where there isn't often funding, especially around ed tech, where a lot of the stuff that is a wish list item, and also around
the assistive and inclusive,
especially around, and well, and that's where this year with a little bit of, we're sort of in between cycles, so the funding has been reduced, but we've really fine-tuned it to be more around digital navigation and adaptive and inclusive tech. And it's really, the dynamics also had changed, so you got to sort of adjust to the dynamics changing, where the initial funding, it was really aimed at ed tech folks coming in. Now it's a lot of the boots on the ground special ed, OT, AT, special services folks coming into the grant and getting them to align with those ed tech or IT folks to make sure that they know that, you know, they're not just randomly buying stuff to put on the network. So it does require a lot more collaboration on their level, and helping get them up. That collaboration has been really critical to getting these grants through the door.
Thanks, Casey. Next slide, please. So just as we're the kind of takeaway for the work that we're doing here in Washington, how can you maximize like your cross-agency partnerships to expand equity of access? One of the things is identifying leads in your agency for your state's digital equity efforts. You know, I checked in within my agency, and there really wasn't anybody else working in that kind of digital equity space within my agency. And then if, determine if there are internal members already at the table. If there are, then working directly with them. I found again that I didn't have anybody else within our agency at the statewide table talking about those federal funds. I was very intentional about outreach and connections. Much of that came out of our state legislative conversations and funding needs, but then also the federal conversations. I was very involved with the EBB program, the ACP program, all of those things at the with K-12. So in those conversations at the state level with many different statewide agencies. And then looking at what processes are in place and how are decisions made, and trying to understand those, so that as I'm working through my internal process, making sure that I am partnering in a way that I can actually deliver at the state level with interagency conversations. And then I'm always looking at the intersectional opportunities. How do we maximize the funding? How do we look at equity of access for K-12 students, especially informing like broadband needs and gaps, and conversations around state funding streams? And then what is my value add to the conversation is sharing information, insights, and feedback from my stakeholders from K-12, and really bringing that perspective to the conversation. Why does the ACP impact students? Is there really an impact? And absolutely, and being really passionate and advocating for K-12, and then gathering those insights and always looking for feedback for key stakeholders, and then assisting with connecting with key stakeholders. One of the things I didn't kind of mention early, was on the slide, was I helped facilitate the broadband action team that helped develop our digital equity plan here at the state. So trying to bring in K-12 perspectives and voice everywhere that I can in these conversations. Thank you.
Hey, Bree. So we
Yes.
had a question in the chat for you. Can you all share more about how you partnered with regional educational service agencies with the project?
Well, part of we had an advantage as we formed our team here at OSPI. They also got the funding to have dedicated ed tech leads at each of the regional ESDs. And so as part of that, and just a little historical, we had previously had some of the federal funding that paid for those positions at the ESDs and at the state level. And that funding, when that funding went away, some kept their leads, and OSPI went down to like one person, a director, my position. So when we regained this funding, we regained the support and staffing we needed to start making those connections and collaborating. So very intentionally, as part of the requirement, legislative requirement, is the reporting on the work that we're doing, both within our retrospect areas, but also together in partnership. And so that built a need for a shared plan. And so we really developed a shared plan around the work that we were doing. So the partnership was not only kind of based on the historical work that we'd done, but also directive by legislative language, but also best practice, right? What are we doing? How do we partner? And that work is instrumental, especially as we're moving into the AI initiatives and looking at how do we inform our work? How do we best support districts throughout the state who, building those relationships both at the state level, but also at the regional level, and just being very intentional about those partnerships. My recommendation is, if you don't already have those partnerships established, take the step. There's nobody else in your agency or in your organization who have those partnerships. Be intentional and look for your value add in that conversation, and where are your shared focuses, so that you can kind of lift all boats.
And then it looks like there's a follow-up question. Oh, go ahead, Casey.
I was gonna speak to the ESDs are one of the most powerful toolboxes I have to working with districts that often come in. So I might get a grant that is really mediocre, and they're not quite sure what they want. So I'll forward that grant to my contact at that ESD and say, can we help them? What insights do you have around what their needs may be? And then also on the flip side, as I'll give out information to those districts around what grants are receiving those grants, and then they can reach out and say, hey, we realize you got this grant, how can we help? And then also I do have ESDs. I have contacts at ESDs that serve as liaisons to districts that don't have anybody in a particular role that the district is missing, and the ESD will act on behalf of those districts to work with them to get those grants done. Sorry, I just wanted to add that in because I think it's important of the power of the ESD to fill in that role.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for talking a little bit about what OSBI is doing in Washington State. I'll move to Amalia Lopez from Lindsay Unified School District in California to provide some perspectives from the LEA side of things. Amalia, please feel free to take it away.
Good morning, everybody. I'm also on the West Coast, so it's bright and early over here, and I bet it's a lot warmer. So I work in Lindsay Unified. Lindsay Unified is a school district in Central California. So not beaches, not palm trees, lots of cows and farms. And we are rural. We have approximately 4,200 to 4,300 learners on any given day. We are preschool through adult school in our district. And most of our learners fall under that covered criteria that Jisoo showed earlier. 5 of the 8 meet that qualification of being second language learners, rural, living in some kind of poverty, whether it's generational or kind of situational poverty. So a lot of this conversation about digital equity and inclusion is something that has been a driving imperative for Lindsay Unified for a long time. I currently manage 4 of the alternative education schools, including our 9-12 alternative ed high schools and the adult school. Prior to this role, I actually managed federal grants for the district, including those that had huge digital equity inclusion parts. I helped coordinate the development of our customized learning management system. So I've done many things in this district. We're most known for the fact that in 2012, long before the pandemic, we began building our own Wi-Fi towers because we were facing those challenges of being a rural community with learners who needed not only hardware access, but that internet broadband access. We began rolling out a full device to every learner K-12 in about 2012 that were age appropriate. For example, preschoolers and kindergartners were using iPads at that time. We ended up moving to Chromebooks for the middle, kind of elementary middle levels. And then of course, more comprehensive laptops for the high school and late middle school learners. And those Wi-Fi towers were originally not funded out of any kind of grant. Those were actually funded out of general funds and just really strategic use of normal funding that you get from the state. And that has become one of the things that we've become known for because it was long before the pandemic. And it was just in response to the socioeconomic reality of our learners. At that time, when we first began rolling out devices, we discovered that kids were sitting outside of district buildings at about 5, 6 p.m. And it prompted some of the staff to say, what are you still doing sitting here? And they said, well, if I sit against this fence, I can get access to the Wi-Fi at school. And that was where the whole kind of real digital equity inclusion conversation came from. But it was actually codified into our strategic design in 2007. Jisoo, next slide, please. And the strategic design is our guiding document in the district. It was written in 2007. And I tell people it's like the Constitution. It's like the Bill of Rights. You don't change the language of it. You just keep reinterpreting it. This is our technology vision that it was written in 2007. And when I began in 2010, it said every learner is going to have an access to the computer. Well, at that time, when I was a teacher, I taught high school English. I had 3 computers in my classroom and 2 were broken. And I remember thinking, well, this is a big dream for us right now. But by 2012, we had already made the progress of actually beginning to build Wi-Fi towers and putting devices in learners' hands. And so the vision itself, we continue to reinterpret it. And I think one of the best examples is AI. But we've also had to do things like now install GoGuardian to monitor learners' uses. We've built out our own custom learning management system that actually is responsive to our model, because it's not just about digital learning and digital access, but it's actually about the processes and the learning experience that learners engage in. And the technology vision also calls out that our educators, our learning facilitators are going to be the most effective accelerator of learning. And that opens a new conversation about the comfort level of tech for adults, how they use it, what purposes they use it for. And so digital equity and inclusion in Lindsay Unified is as complex as Jisoo and Kurt outlined, which is there are so many elements that come into it that go far beyond devices and hardware and actually broadband access. Next slide, please, Jisoo. And for me, sitting here as the principal of a very disenfranchised learner population, not only am I doing 9-12 learners, but I'm doing those that often have significant learning needs, including those on IEPs and different things. And for me, digital equity and inclusion, you have to have a paradigm shift that thinks about population, purpose, and pedagogy. Because population goes well beyond digital natives and digital immigrants. I struggle with those terms because those terms make an assumption that that's a generational divide, that young people are digital natives and older people are digital immigrants. I have found the opposite to be true in many cases. I have my own terms because I work with learners not only in the 9-12 level, but I work with those in adult school who are trying to get a GED, who are trying to learn English for the first time or obtain a US citizenship. And what we have is we have digital distrusters. Those are the ones who actually don't have a desire to access text, even though you're trying to support them with it. My favorite are digital choice makers. I have 15-year-olds who are very good at their phone, super good at TikTok, right? And then when you put them on a Chromebook, they don't know what to do. They don't actually have the digital literacy skills and the digital access skills to work because the only tech they're choosing to use is their phone. And they don't have any transferable skills right now that they're willing to leverage. And those become new challenges in terms of the population that you're serving, because you have to really contextualize what do these populations need. And a lot of the grants that we've benefited from in Lindsay Unified have done that. Who's the population we're trying to serve with this tech? What are their specific needs? And what can that implementation look like? What kind of resources and support and things like that? For me, purpose comes into play as well. What are the spaces that actually need digital access? I have lots of different examples. We serve a large population of migrant learners who actually travel seasonally to pick fruit and things like that for agricultural work. The minute they leave our district, they're losing access to everything we've built and offered them. They're losing access to the community Wi-Fi. They're losing access to some of the programs that they need. And so we have to always contend with what's the space that they're moving into? Can they take a hotspot with them? Will that hotspot even work out of state? Many of our learners actually migrate north to Washington in the summer to pick cherries and apples. And the minute they leave and they want to continue their learning, super challenging. So we have to consider that space. There are other spaces we have to consider in adult school at night. We have many adult learners who are learning English for the first time, and we are their first introduction to digital tech. We give them a device, but they don't know how to use it. They don't know how to interact with online programs. And so that learning experience is a really big challenge for them. So it's not as simple as putting the device in their hands and saying, great news, you have Wi-Fi, you have a device. There is so much teaching and learning about the power of tech for them to get to their purpose, because their meaningful purpose is they want to speak English to actually better produce for their lives. And the last one is the one that's probably nearest and dearest to my heart, not just because I'm a current principal of a high school, but because I coordinated a lot of this for the district in the past, and I've been such a big part of some of our digital efforts, is the pedagogy. We have to continue to work to shy away from technology as a replacement for learning experiences. And I always tell people there's a Google Doc trap. Many educators who are very well intentioned will just turn everything into a digital worksheet, right? Lots of Google Docs and things like that, but that's not actually transforming the learning experience. The learning experience has to be as iterative as the technology. In 2007, when the district wrote that they were going to have a device in every kid's hand, they had no idea how fast that would evolve. Because what we buy as a district now for kids to use is completely different than what we bought in 2012. And things evolve. And the pedagogy is where I see the biggest problem, is that we still have credential programs in every state of every size, student teacher programs, residency programs, that still haven't adapted to the pedagogy of how do you truly use technology to transform the learning experience. In one of my settings here, I have some learners who come out of juvenile hall type settings, and they are learning technology sometimes for the first time. And one of the things we really push is I can't take all these learners to Washington, D.C. to see the Vietnam War Memorial. So when they learn about the Vietnam War, as much as I wish I could fly them all to Washington, D.C. to experience that, I can't. But good news is that the Vietnam War Memorial is online with an interactive platform. And so that should be the starting and the launching point of the instruction. It should be the starting point of letting them experience that through technology before you get into the performance tasks, before you start to ask them to process their learning. And those are the kinds of shifts we have to start to put into our curriculum. Jisoo mentioned generative AI. That's also a topic near and dear to my heart. 2 years ago, no school districts were talking about AI like they're talking about now. But that has created new problems, because more access means more problems with young learners sometimes. And now you've got lots of learners who are just trying to produce work through AI. And so now educators have to adapt to, do I just check every kid's work for AI, or do I actually change my tasks so that they cannot produce something that it could be generated by AI? And these are new teaching and learning skills that the curriculum has to continue to, move with. And lastly, when you do have more technology in kids' hands, particularly, you have more problems that you have to monitor. It goes into the social emotional space. You get bullying online, you get all kinds of things. There are young learners in our district and probably every district everywhere who have actually been banned by Google, which takes a lot of work as a 5th grader or something. And those are new problems you have to contend with. You have to contend with it as you provide access. You are creating new situations that you're going to have to address with other technologies, monitoring technologies, other resources and scaffolds, new conversations with families and caregivers of those children. And so digital equity and inclusion goes so far beyond devices when you're working at the K-12 or the school district level, because the more access we provide, the more considerations we have to make for the populations that we're serving, for the purposes that are driving that access, and for the pedagogy. And the pedagogy is one that I think we have the furthest to go in terms of once you have the devices in hands and you have the internet up, what are we doing it with it skillfully? And how are we preparing educators to actually serve their learners, whether it's adult learners or, 1st graders, really, truly, and productively in a transformed learning experience? But thank you. Happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Amalia. I'll move to my colleague Carla from COSIN to help close us out with some of the resources that their organization has developed. Carla, please feel free to take it away.
Hi, Jisoo, thank you. And I'm bringing up the rest of the left coast. I am from COSIN, but I laugh that I'm a left coast office because I live in Oregon, between my colleagues in Washington and California. So about 4 years ago, COSIN started really looking at what digital equity was meaning as we were moving from more in that increased home learning and knowing that in order to advocate for the K-12 education needs, we needed to have some data to back up the stories we were trying to tell. So we started our digital equity home study, and we started asking questions like, how many students actually have home access? How many students were using, or how were the students using that home connectivity? And how did things change when students returned to school? Again, it was about showing folks the data because we need that for telling our stories. So in our year 1 report, go ahead and change slides, Jisoo, please. In our year 1 report, what we found was it was all about remote video, or remote learning, now called for higher speeds, lowering data caps, and understanding multiple learners' access needs within one household. Year 2 of this study was really taking a look at how students were using that connectivity. And we found that students were using the school network more at home than they were during the school day. Next slide. The next year, we started the data dashboard. And when I first saw this data dashboard, I was so excited. I said, I would have loved to have had this on that March 12th, the day I was called into the office because we had to cancel a meeting. And my assistant superintendent said, we're moving everybody online in 2 weeks. I said, there might be a challenge with that. I wish I would have had the data that is available in this dashboard to be able to pinpoint down to the zip code where our students in Oregon did not have connectivity, did not have reliable, robust connectivity that would allow them to do that remote learning. And it wasn't just about our students, it was about our teachers as well. Next slide. We also do more research we understand that what we're doing in education in the US is not the sole place we need to think about what's happening. We have a global knowledge economy now. So we do an annual Driving K-12 Innovation global study. It has about 130 advisory members from across the world. And each year, we identify the hurdles, the accelerators, and the tech enablers that will impact teaching and learning. The important thing here is that we're not just paying attention to what's happening in our own backyard, but that we're looking at what innovations are happening in other places and how we can make sure that we're removing policy issues that are sometimes the barriers for getting things done. Oftentimes we see that the barriers that are created by state or national government in policies have good intentions, but the workload or the understanding that all school districts don't fit one size. They can provide challenges to the districts that are oftentimes in our small and rural districts nearly insurmountable. Our ESDs, as our friends from Washington said, are critical in many of our rural communities for helping districts navigate the policies, the challenges, whether it's connectivity, whatever the issue might be. So in terms of the work that we do at COSN, what we're trying to do is provide a clear understanding of where communities are connected with high-speed, robust, and reliable connections. We've learned that cell towers don't serve all communities. Satellite dishes come with challenges like snow. And getting all the right people around the table to drive that change is essential. I'm going to leave it there so that we can get to some questions in our last couple of minutes.
Awesome. I'm going to stop sharing my slides and invite the panelists to come back on camera. So thank you all for sharing the wonderful work that each of you are engaged in. For the participants, I'm from the U.S. Department of Education, so I had to include a little bit of learning sciences into this webinar. We all know that after absorbing content, it helps to sort of spit back out in your own words what you've learned so that you can retain it better. So it'd be great. I just put a Padlet link in the chat. It'd be great if you could all take a moment to reflect on the Padlet about how thoughts shared by our panelists resonate with you, and note any initial ideas you're having as a result of hearing from Bree, from Casey, from Molly, and Carla. If you haven't used Padlet before, you can contribute to this wall by pushing the plus sign at the bottom right of the page, and you should be able to comment on each other's posts as well. So please feel free to drop in your reflections and any ideas into the Padlet in your own words. But just as a closing question, Carla, Molly, and Bree, do you have any words of advice for K-12 education leaders as they begin thinking about maybe participating in some of these upcoming opportunities that will be announced by NTIA under the Digital Equity Act? And I'm happy to go in any order, so I'll just open it up to the floor. Bree?
I just raise my hand. It's like, I got this. I get so excited. I really think that it does come down to intentionally building the relationship and having the conversations with those in talking in the space of talking about the funding, the NTIA funding. There are agencies in your state that are people who are interested in working with you, interested in hearing your insights. And I think it's important, especially from the K-12, historically, we haven't always been at the table or in those conversations with like the Department of Commerce. And so this is a bit of a new area since the pandemic. We have needed to insert ourselves. We've been inserted, but we also have had the need to insert ourselves. So continuing to build those alliances, those relationships, and then also know who in your state, who the state legislators are who support the EI work, and really just knowing what their focuses are and working intentionally with them as well.
Carla, I'll go to you next since you have your hand raised.
Sure. I think that I agree with Bree on all those things. It's about collaboration. And one of the things I've learned over the years, having done a variety of other federal programs, is that the technology folks that I've run into, both in my state and nationally, are some of the most collaborative people I know. So don't hesitate to reach out to those organizations within your state. I know I have some colleagues from Oregon here. Stuart Long was one of my go-to people saying, okay, what's happening at the ESD? What is the message I need to bring back to the state? And I still reach out to folks saying, okay, what is the message I need to bring back to COSN? Listen to one another and help advocate, not lobby, but advocate for what you need. Have those stories to tell. Be able to say that, well, out in Elgin, Oregon, they have a satellite dish on the top of Mount Fanning. And when it snows, they lose all their internet connectivity. So the internet service provider has to drive a truck with a cat on the back up as far as they can drive till it's too steep, put the cat up to where it's too steep, and then that internet service provider person has to snowshoe up to the tower, climb 150 feet of an icy tower, shovel the snow off of it, and if it snows again the next day, rinse and repeat. Have images to tell your story. Because we have a lot of folks out there that feel like if you just put up a cell tower, all your problems are solved. That doesn't work when you have to go around tribal lands, when you're digging through basalt to lay fiber, when you have internet service providers that are the smaller ones who can't see the return on investment in laying fiber out to a small rural community. And helping folks understand this isn't just about education. We're kind of all in this together. It's about economic development, as well as digital access for our students, but access for the community as a whole. Make these people be your friends. Invite them to your meetings. Invite yourself to their meetings so that you have, as Bree said, that you're at the table for the discussion.
Malia, I'll go to you next, and then Casey, please help us close this out.
I love that comment, Carla, about the snow, and that's very true here in Lindsay. There's a hill in Lindsay that we can't get Wi-Fi around for the life of us. So I think the thing I would add, and Lindsay again has written a lot of grants, and one of the things that makes those successful, not only in the writing and the award, but in the implementation, is knowing your data. We design our own surveys to administer. We design our own data metrics so that when we write these grants and we want to solve a problem, we say, we really know who we're talking about. 67% of learners need this because we've surveyed, we've asked, and we've done a lot of efforts through local control and accountability funding formulas to understand that when we're ready to write a grant, we know exactly the purpose that we're trying to serve. Like Carla said, because if you have those parts of the community that don't have access, you're going to have to demonstrate that in data. And I always encourage districts to kind of think about what data you need and create the survey, create the metrics so that you have it to work from, because unfortunately, larger state and federal metrics are never going to work for those conversations. Nobody would know about Todd's Hill in Lindsay if you didn't live here. Now, if you live here, you'd know that nobody gets Wi-Fi around that corner. And so I agree with Carla that you have to go into a grant writing experience with the intent of what's the purpose we're serving and what do we have to prove and tell that story.
And I was just going to say, I have almost that storytelling baked into my grants, in that I ask, how are you going to share your story? Like, I can only do so much to elevate your voice, but I think the power lies really in the schools sharing the stories of how they're supporting digital equity, not just with their school, but with their communities and legislators, that they have to uplift their voice and share that out, or else those voices don't get heard.
All right. Thank you to all four of our panelists for sharing your bit of knowledge with us this morning. Let's give our panel another virtual round of applause in the chat if you're still on. Thank you again to Bree, Amalia, Casey, and Carla for taking a bit of time to share your stories with us. I hope for the participants and attendees, this session gave you some initial thoughts around what you could explore as K-12 leaders when NTIA announces some funding opportunities later this year. I think a common thread between what all panelists said was the value of collaboration and storytelling. So I hope that's something that you take away from the last hour. Brief sneak peek of what's to come. Part 2 of this webinar will happen in mid-April, I believe April 17th, led by the American Library Association and Common Sense, and focusing more on community partnerships, including with libraries that can help advance digital equity. So I hope you'll be able to join us for part 2. We'll definitely share that information with this crowd when it's ready. Again, thank you all for your time listening in this morning, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody. Well.